Enemies. If any of you want a free sample later, feel free to contact me. As a novelist, I see the world through the lens of storytelling. I believe that stories are ways for us to share important life lessons. So that being the case, I hope you'll bear with me as I share some of my favorite quotes from some of my favorite stories to help reinforce my points. This talk is called Imperatives for Change. Part 1, Imperatives to End Poverty. Causing people to suffer because you hate them is terrible. But causing them to suffer because you've forgotten how to care, that's really hard to understand. Dr. Julian Bashir, Star Trek Deep Space Nine. Thank you. Here's some basic math for you. We currently produce enough food for 10 billion people. There are only 7 billion of us on this planet, and yet every year close to 800 million starve. Now, when we have enough food for everyone, but close to 800 million people starve anyway, there's a word for that. That word is murder. I'd like you to pause for a moment and consider a scenario in which you might consider it to be morally justified to withhold food from someone. So maybe a plane crashes somewhere in the wilderness and the adults agree that they're going to eat less food so that the children can have more. I'm not sure what scenario you just imagined, but I can tell you that they all have one thing in common. They are all predicated on the idea of scarcity, that we ration the food because there simply isn't enough to go around. However, in the real world, scarcity is a myth. Every few years, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations puts out a report called the Statistical Yearbook. In 2012's version, they had the following to say regarding the productive potential of global agriculture. The growth of global agriculture's productive potential has so far been more than sufficient to exceed population growth, resulting in a steady, albeit slow, increase in average per capita food availability. For the world as a whole, per capita food availability has risen from about 2,200 kilocalories per person per day in the early 1960s to nearly 2,800 kilocalories per person per day in 2006. While developing countries even recorded a leap from 1,850 kilocalories per person per day to over 2,600. This growth in food availability, in conjunction with improved access to food, helped reduce the percentage of chronically undernourished people in developing countries from 34% in the mid-1970s to just 15% 3 decades later. Despite a growing population, people today have access to more food than they did 30 years ago, and this is due to a phenomenon that Buckminster Fuller calls ephemeralization, our ability to produce more with less. I would also like you to note that the World Food Program lists many causes for world hunger, including unstable markets, climate change, and war, and nowhere on that list do the words overpopulation or food scarcity appear. What's more, we can produce even more food through vertical farming. Now, if you don't know what a vertical farm is, picture a skyscraper where each story is used to grow a different crop. There are many advantages to this method of farming, including constant year-round production with an acre of vertical farmland equal in production to 4 to 6 acres of traditional farmland, minimized risk of pest infestation, and as Stamos pointed out, vertical farming uses significantly less water, to the tune of 10%. So we're already producing enough food for everyone on this planet, and we can easily produce more simply by employing technology that already exists. What about water? Well, those of us who've been in TZM for a while know that we've covered the methods of purification and desalinization, and if you'd like more information on that, I suggest you watch Peter's talk, An Economic Calculation in a Resource-Based Economy. However, I would also like you to note that we have technology that can create clean drinking water from almost any source, no matter how contaminated. Our governments have known that poverty is a solvable problem for decades. I was going to share with you a report from the Food and Agriculture Organization that was released in 2002, but I'm going to skip ahead because it essentially says the same thing, that we have enough food for everybody and that the chronically undernourished problem is a problem of distribution. So, if poverty has been a solvable problem for at least 14 years, why does such deprivation persist? And what role do we as citizens play in changing that situation? Those are questions I'd like you to consider as you leave this presentation today. Part 2, Imperatives to End Climate Change. How about this? It's here. It's been here all along. You're just too damn stupid to see it. The apocalypse, you're soaking in it. What, did you think a gong was going to sound? Time to jump on your horse and fight the big fight? Starting pistol went off a long time ago, boys. You're playing for the bad guys. Lindsay McDonald, Angel of the Series. Thank you. Delegates at the COP21 conference in Paris reaffirmed their commitment to keep the world's temperature from rising more than 2 degrees. Now, where does that figure come from? There are many different sources, but one of the more prominent ones is a study by Professor James Hansen, the former head of NASA's Goddard Institute for Space Studies. He found that warming of more than 2 degrees can trigger feedback systems that accelerate climate change. To quote his research, a cumulative industrial-era limit of roughly 500 gigatons of carbon fossil fuel emissions and 100 gigatons of carbon storage in the biosphere and soil would keep climate close to the Holocene range to which humanity and other species are adapted. Cumulative emissions of roughly 1,000 gigatons of carbon, sometimes associated with 2 degrees of global warming, would spur slow feedbacks and eventual warming of 3 to 4 degrees with disastrous consequences. Now, Dr. Hansen mentioned feedback systems. What does he mean by that? Well, one such system would be melting permafrost. So over thousands of years, billions of tons of organic matter from plants and animals that died in the Arctic have been trapped underneath the permafrost. If the permafrost were to melt, a likely consequence of 2 degrees of global warming, that matter will begin to decompose, releasing billions of tons of methane gas into the atmosphere. Doctors Kevin Schaefer, Hugh Lantwit, and Vladimir Romanovsky of the University of Colorado studied the potential consequences of melting permafrost. They concluded that the billions of tons of gas released would accelerate the effects of climate change caused by anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. Available estimates of permafrost carbon feedback indicate 120 plus or minus 85 gigatons of carbon emissions from thawing permafrost. This is equivalent to 5.7 plus or minus 4% of total anthropogenic emissions and would increase global temperatures by up to 0.5 degrees. Projections indicate that 60% of the permafrost emissions will occur after 2100, indicating that not accounting for permafrost emissions risks overshooting the 2-degree warming target. Now, melting permafrost is one of our problems, but the biggest issue would be a shutdown of what is called the thermal haline circulation, or the global conveyor belt. The global conveyor belt is a system of ocean currents that is kept in motion by the difference in temperature and salinity between surface water and deep water, and it's responsible for most of the world's weather. It looks like this. As you can see, cool water comes down through the Atlantic, rounds the tip of Africa, where it splits into 2 paths, one going through the Indian Ocean and the other through the Pacific. There it warms, comes back around the western coast of Africa, and rejoins the original flow. Now, this incidentally is why England experiences such balmy winters despite having a latitude equivalent to that of Alberta. That warm water heats everything up. Geologists have discovered that at several points throughout Earth's history, when the planet's average temperature has risen more than a few degrees, the global conveyor belt has shut down. The global conveyor belt is responsible for more than just the world's weather. It also delivers oxygen from the surface of the ocean down into the watery depths where it nourishes marine life. If the global conveyor belt were to shut down, all of that marine life will die. This is called an anoxic event. Anoxic events create the perfect breeding ground for anaerobic bacteria, and anaerobic bacteria produce hydrogen sulfide, a highly toxic compound. A study by Drs. Lee Kump, Alexander Pavlov, and Michael Arthur of the University of Pennsylvania examined the potential release of hydrogen sulfide due to anoxic events, and their findings were quite troubling. The calculations presented here indicate that a massive hydrogen sulfide release constitutes a possible consequence of widespread and deep oceanic anoxia. The greatest extinction of the Phanerozoic occurred in the late Permian, and anoxia remains an important component of most proposed extinction mechanisms. If hydrogen sulfide is released into the atmosphere in sufficient quantities, it will kill most of the plant and animal life on this planet. So when we talk about human extinction as a likely consequence of climate change, we're not exaggerating. If you want to understand global warming in 4 words, here they are: famine, pestilence, war, and death. These words may conjure to mind images from the book of Revelations, but let me assure you, if humanity's extinction comes to pass, it will not be a consequence of some cosmically ordained event. It will be a consequence of our constant war against our own ecosystem. So what can we do about it? Well, the answer is that opportunities to end climate change are abundant. A study by a team of researchers from MIT concluded that America could power itself thousands of times over using just geothermal energy. Now, I cannot list those researchers for you because they number in the dozens, but the study is called The Future of Geothermal Energy and was published in 2006. It had the following to say: by almost any criteria, the accessible US resource base is enormous, greater than 13 million quads, or 130,000 times the current annual consumption of primary energy in the United States. Of course, the economically recoverable reserve will be much lower, subject to many technical and economic constraints. They go on to specify that as a worst-case scenario, 2% of those 13 million quads will be recoverable. 2% of 130,000 is 2,600, meaning that America could power itself 2,600 times with geothermal energy alone using technology that existed 10 years ago. What about wind power? Professors Mark Jacobson of Stanford University and Christina Archer of the University of Delaware conducted a study to estimate the maximum global energy potential of wind power. Their conclusions were that wind power alone could meet half the world's energy demand. Our simulations examine whether approximately 4 million 5-megawatt turbines can provide at least 5.75 terawatts of power, enough to supply 50% of all purpose end-use power demand in 2030. When turbines are spread over lands outside the tropics, away from the poles, and in all regions below 3 kilometers of altitude, the output jumps to 7.5 terawatts, more than enough. Another interdisciplinary study by MIT studied solar energy with the following conclusions. In the United States, the vast majority of solar-suitable land is located in the Southwest. Recent studies have concluded that in this region, between 54,000 and 87,000 square miles of land will be suitable for concentrated solar power plants. Depending on assumptions about system capacity factor and thermal storage, this land could support between 6.8 and 7.4 terawatts of generation capacity. Now, I'd like you to pause to remember that 5.75 terawatts was estimated as half the world's energy demand. We just found the other half. Opportunities to end global warming are numerous. The only thing standing in our way is a market system that prioritizes profit over human health. And if we do nothing, our children will suffer for it. People believe that climate change, deprivation, poverty, and loss of biodiversity are simply unsolvable problems, but nothing could be further from the truth. We have the means to make a better world. All we need is the will, which is why I'm going to end this section with the second half of the quote I used at the beginning. Every day, you sit behind your desk and you learn a little more how to accept the world the way it is. But here's the rub. Heroes don't do that. Heroes don't accept the world the way it is. They fight. Part 3. Thanks. You don't have to clap. Part 3, imperatives to end inequality. One thing that I love about the Zeitgeist movement is that we are a multinational movement with people from dozens of different countries. When I attended Z-Day in Toronto last year, I saw men and women of all ethnicities working together toward a common goal. The train of thought behind a resource-based economy appeals to people from all walks of life. Throughout all of human history, societies have been shaped by the few imposing their version of order on the many. We're going to do something different. The transition to a resource-based economy will be one in which people from all over the globe, people of all races, genders, ages, and orientations work together to build an economic model that makes human health its #1 priority, and that is remarkable. In preparation for this talk, I spoke with several different people, including one of my favorite academics, a Latina woman who has spent her life fighting oppression. I asked her to help me understand poverty from the perspective of marginalized people, and I would like to share those reflections with you. Those of us who have been in TZM for a while know that poverty is a form of structural violence, one that kills millions of people every year. However, it's important to understand that the experience of poverty for a poor white man living in Chicago is vastly different from that of a poor Indian woman living in Mumbai. And when economic violence is combined with racism, the result can only be called a war crime. To this day, the Malthusian belief in overpopulation persists. Western nations often prescribe extreme measures such as sterilization for poorer countries that are stigmatized for their higher birth rates. and these methods of population control are often brutal and lethal. For instance, in India, women were forced into mass sterilization camps. Now, I have already demonstrated to you that we produce more than enough food for everyone, that we can create clean drinking water from almost any source. There is no need to violate these women's bodies in this way, and yet we continue to do it. We do it because the myth of overpopulation allows us to perpetuate the myth of scarcity, and that allows Western hegemony to operate unchecked. But won't higher birth rates overtax the planet? I hear this question a lot, and I'd like to say that if you're worried about this, you should know that a report by the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs indicates that with the turn of the century, the rate of population growth in developed nations dropped from 1.76% to 0.7%. As quality of life improves, including food security, healthcare, and access to contraceptives, people choose to have fewer children. This should not be a surprise, as we no longer need 5 or 6 children just to ensure that some reach adulthood. Another issue to consider is environmental racism. This is an issue where poor ethnic communities get saddled with dangerous industrial projects simply because they aren't as politically organized. For instance, a First Nations community in Northern Ontario has been unable to drink its tap water for 5 years due to the presence of radioactive particles. They have petitioned Ottawa many times for help. No help has come. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has promised a remedy by 2021. It's already been 5 years. These people have been drinking bottled water for 5 years because they can't drink their tap water. Now, that might work for drinking water, but what do they do when they have to shower? What do they do when they have to do laundry? How will the presence of radioactive particles affect their health? We could also consider the case of a poor Latino neighborhood near Los Angeles, a Latino neighborhood that has been exposed to lead poisoning from the nearby Exide recycling plant. Exide was able to skirt state laws that would have prevented them from spewing toxic chemicals into the atmosphere. City officials tested the soil for lead and found over 1,500 parts per million in that neighborhood, a highly toxic figure. If anyone needs the hope that a resource-based economy can offer, it is the poor and the marginalized. That is one reason why we should continue our fine practice of reaching out to as many diverse people as possible. Another reason is that we need the voices of diverse people to help build a better world. How many of you recognize these people? Excellent. All right. I do as well. I grew up with these people. Gene Roddenberry had a vision of a world without poverty, without racism, sexism, homophobia, or discrimination of any kind. He had a vision of a world where people could live their own lives and pursue their own goals, and where no one was left to die hungry and alone. If you're anything like me, then when you watched Star Trek as a kid, you said, I want to live in that world. But it's important to understand that a world without racism cannot exist unless people of color play a role in shaping it. A world without sexism cannot exist unless women and people who don't conform to a gender binary play a role in shaping it. A world without homophobia cannot exist unless people who identify as LGBT play a role in shaping it. If we're going to rebuild society from the ground up, something that I very much believe in, we need to work together with everyone to include as many diverse voices as possible. Finally, I'd like to share with you a theory of mine. It's something that I came up with after researching so much for 5 years. It goes a little something like this. Capitalism makes us see the worst in everything. When you look at this, or this, or this, you can't help but feel that such suffering is an immutable, inevitable consequence of the human condition. You need only look at our slogans and the way we talk to recognize the cynicism that pervades our culture. That's why the Zeitgeist movement is so important. We offer more than just the truth. We offer hope. And hope is an absolutely essential component of human health and well-being. So, are you guys ready for the last quote? All right, here we go. This is the best one in my opinion. Nothing in the world is the way that it ought to be. It's harsh and cruel. But that's why there's us, champions. It doesn't matter where we come from, what we've done or suffered, or even if we make a difference. We live as if the world were what it should be, to show the world what it can be. That is what the Zeitgeist movement represents to me. If you'd like to learn more, you can follow me on Twitter, check out my books or my blog. I'd like to thank you very much for having me, and I look forward to meeting many of you tonight.